Unit 2, Lesson 2, the Transcontinental Railroad. Our objective is that students will be able to identify new technologies of the Industrial Revolution, like the railroad, and explain their economic and social effects on the United States. Our essential question: how did the inventions of the late 1800s propel the United States as a major world power? Unit 2, Lesson 2, Transcontinental Railroad Vocabulary. The railroad lines in the United States in 1861, pre-Civil War, were relatively new and an untried invention. They were not uniformly built. There was little to no standardization, often owned by civilians or groups of civilians, where the lines were left vacant when profits disappeared. A trip from the East Coast to the West Coast prior to the Civil War could cost as much as $1,000. Or after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, after the end of the Civil War, the trip would cost only $150. America's first steam locomotive made its debut in 1830, and over the next 2 decades, railroad tracks linked many cities on the East Coast. By 1850, some 9,000 miles of track had been laid east of the Missouri River. During that same period, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States. This trend increased dramatically after the discovery of gold in California in 1848. President Abraham Lincoln was instrumental to the implementation and completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. He signed the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1, 1862, 1 year into the Civil War. This was to be a 10-year project to build a railway to the Pacific Ocean, and it was completed in 1869, 3 years early. First, railroads were built north to the south. Secondly, railroads were built east to west, connecting in Promontory, Utah in 1869. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 gave Congress power over the growing railroad monopolies, and it broke up their illicit and sometimes illegal activity and made national railway travel safer, cheaper, and cleaner. The Pacific Railroad Act stipulated that the Central Pacific Railroad Company would start building in Sacramento and continue east across the Sierra Nevada, while a second company, the Union Pacific Railroad, would build westward from the Missouri River near the Iowa-Nebraska border. The 2 lines of track would meet in the middle. The bill did not designate an exact location, as each company would receive 6,400 acres of land and $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track built. From the beginning, then, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was set up in terms of a competition between the 2 companies to see who could build the most track in terms of mileage. This reason, and this reason alone, is why some of the railway routes in the relatively flat Midwest plains take very curvaceous routes instead of in a straight line, as the Central Pacific Railroad Company and the Union Pacific Railroad Company were trying to gain as much money and land from the federal government as possible. Cornelius Vanderbilt, commonly known as the Commodore, was a major figure in the expansion of regional and multi-state railroads. He founded a transport company during the 1848 and 1849 gold rush, where he became a millionaire seemingly overnight. Later went on to own the New York and Harlem Railroad and Railways, and he began to offer the first rail service from New York to Chicago and back after purchasing rail lines in and around Detroit and Chicago in 1873. The Central Pacific Railroad, founded in Sacramento, California, 1862. They built the Transcontinental Railroad line from Sacramento, California to Promontory, Utah, completed May 10th of 1869. All told, they laid 690 miles of track, or 39% of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1865, after struggling with retaining workers due to the difficulty of the labor, Charles Crocker, who was in charge of construction for the Central Pacific, began hiring Chinese laborers. By that time, some 50,000 Chinese immigrants were living on the West Coast, many having arrived during the gold rush. This was controversial at the time as the Chinese were considered an inferior race due to pervasive racism in the United States. The Union Pacific Railroad was founded July 1st, 1862 in Washington, D.C., and they built the Transcontinental Railroad from Omaha, Nebraska to Promontory, Utah. Completed again May 10th, 1869. They laid over 1,000 miles of track, or roughly 61% of the Transcontinental Railroad. After General Grenville Dodge, a hero of the Union Army, took control as chief engineer, the Union Pacific finally began to move westward in May 1866. The company suffered bloody attacks on its workers by Native Americans, including members of the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes, who were understandably threatened by the progress of the white man and his iron horse across their native ancestral lands. So why was the Transcontinental Railroad so important? The modern equivalent today would be putting a man on Mars and colonizing another planet. That is how difficult the task was of not only building the Transcontinental Railroad, but operating it safely. It connected the two American coasts, the East Coast and the West Coast. It made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier, as there were more abundant resources in the West and higher dense populations in the East. Though there were some drawbacks, as the westward expansion escalated conflicts with Native Americans who were fighting to retain some control over their ancestral lands. Facts and figures of the Transcontinental Railroad. The total miles of track laid were 1,776. There are 15 tunnels that run through the Sierra Nevada mountain range alone. The Central Pacific hired nearly 15,000 Chinese laborers throughout the course of the 7-year period, and the Union Pacific hired more than 8,000 Irish and German and Italian laborers. It was estimated to cost approximately $60 million, or over $1.2 billion in today's dollars. Throughout the 7-year period the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, there were over 12,000 casualties, more than 1,000 of them dead Chinese laborers. The Chinese laborers proved to be tireless workers, and Crocker hired more and more of them. With those 15,000 Chinese laborers worked under brutal conditions in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And by early 1867, the Central Pacific had built huge wooden trestles on the western slopes and used gunpowder and nitroglycerin to blast tunnels through the granite, resulting in a lot of the casualties seen. The impact of the Transcontinental Railroad on the United States cannot be underestimated. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad opened up the American West to more rapid development. With the completion of the track, the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States was cut from a matter of months to under a week. Connecting the two American coasts made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier than ever before. The railroad also facilitated westward expansion, escalating conflicts between Native American tribes and settlers who now had easier access to new territories that they would often claim as their own. The impact of the Transcontinental Railroad was felt by every American because of the faster transportation of goods. Goods were now easier and cheaper and faster to transport from the East Coast and the West Coast to the middle parts of the country. Another impact of the Transcontinental Railroad was the creation of time zones in the continental United States. The Interstate Commerce Commission in 1918 created 5 time zones for the continental United States. The Eastern Time Zone, shown in yellow, the Central Time Zone, shown in green, the Mountain Time Zone, shown in blue, the Pacific Time Zone, shown in red, and the Alaskan Time Zone, shown in purple. Lastly, one of the most vital resources for the survival of the Native American tribes throughout the continental United States was the American buffalo. The Transcontinental Railroad all but eliminated buffalo in the American West. Buffalo were now hunted en masse for their hides, their skin, and their meat, and the bones were left in huge piles alongside the railroad stopyards and shipyards. Because of amazing conservation efforts from Native American groups and tribes throughout America, the American buffalo is experiencing a rebirth. These are pictures I took while traveling through Wyoming a few years ago on vacation. The herds of the buffalo move freely throughout Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and some parts of South Dakota and North Dakota.